Welcome. I'm Jane Edwards. I'm an experienced BACP accredited counsellor and psychotherapist and a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church. And I recently completed a PhD on what makes a good funeral. This talk is part of a series of 4 Lent talks for 2024 on death, bereavement, and the making of a good funeral for Christians. And we're on the 4th talk, how can Christians find a hopeful way through grief? So we'll begin with a poem by Anne Thorpe, Belief. I have to believe that you still exist somewhere, that you still watch me sometimes, that you still love me somehow. I have to believe that life has meaning somehow, that I'm useful here sometimes, that I make small differences somewhere. I have to believe that I need to stay here for some time, that all this teaches me something, so that I can meet you again somewhere. When someone we love dies, grief begins, and we need to go through it. If we don't go through it, if we don't give ourselves time or permission to grieve, we're merely postponing it. We have to do the emotional work sooner or later. And as was mentioned in the last talk, we all need to grieve, no matter whether we're children or adults, no matter our intellectual capacity, we all need to grieve. Children usually grieve differently to adults. When a child grieves, we often describe it as like puddle jumping. They seem to be carrying on life as normal, playing and being happy, but then they have a time of being sad and upset, almost as if they've jumped into a puddle of grief. And then they jump out again and carry on with life. This is a healthy way for children to grieve. Whereas when we're adults and someone you love dies, we can feel as if we're cast into a foreign land and we're lost. It's very natural when we're bereaved to feel lost. We don't know how to go forward. We don't know what is familiar anymore because everything seems different. We're like lost sheep. And so we recall God's response to the lost sheep. The parable of Jesus in Luke chapter 15 pictures the shepherd who leaves the 99 sheep and goes out in search of the one that was lost. And when the shepherd finds the sheep, he carries it home in his arms. This is one of the reasons why Psalm 23 is such a comforting psalm for us when we're bereaved. In bereavement, we are like the lost sheep. We need reminding of an image of God as shepherd, seeking us out and carrying us home. So let us consider some theories of grief, how they've changed, and how our Christian theology can help us find hopeful ways through grief. The first theory of grief was devised by psychoanalyst Freud, and at the heart of it was the concept of grief work, the process of acknowledging and expressing painful emotions such as guilt and anger. He argued that this led the bereaved to being freed from bondage to the person who died, that they'd be able to adjust to life without them and build new relationships. So grief was seen as largely about letting go and moving on after going through difficult emotions. While important though this theory was, it's no longer the case that we believe the focus of our grieving should be letting go. Yes, we need to accept our loved one has died, and this may take some time. But what we believe now is that keeping a continuing bond with the person who's died is a healthy part of grief and will help us. So what is a continuing bond? Well, it's very much a unique bond between us and the person who died, so it will vary. But often it involves keeping a sense of the person with us, keeping some of their belongings that give us a sense of closeness with them, speaking about them with people who knew them, remembering them and our relationship with them. When we keep a continuing bond, we know that our loved one has died, we accept that this has happened, and yet in some ways they're still with us. We keep them in our mind and our heart. And research supports this and suggests it's helpful. So when people come and see me because someone they love has died, one of the first questions I ask them is, tell me about them. I invite them to speak about the person who's died and what the relationship meant to them. Grief is not just about letting go. It's often about having a healthy, continuing bond with the person who died. And in terms of theology, our belief that death is not the end, our trust that there is an afterlife is helpful. Our doctrine of the communion of saints, the heavenly community that we're one with through worship, prayers, and the Eucharist, one with through the love of God, our doctrine of the communion of saints supports the theory of there being a continuing bond. We light candles. We pray for those we love who have died. We live out our Christian beliefs, and in doing so, we maintain a continuing bond with the person who died, and this helps us. It helps us in our grief. Those who came after Freud, such as Kubler-Ross, Bowlby, and Murray Parks, theorized about stages of grief. Stages such as denial, not accepting the reality of the death, followed by bargaining with God, then a stage of being angry, of depression, and finally acceptance. Well, the idea of there being a linear sequence of stages of grief has been strongly critiqued. We don't hold to that any longer. But some of these states may well occur, just not necessarily in a particular order. We might go backwards and forwards between them, rather than it being a linear progression. So we may struggle to accept the reality of the death, and this is when prayer can be helpful. We can be honest with God about our feelings, our struggle to believe that our loved ones died, and we can come back again and again to God with our disbelief and ask for God's help. And the funeral ritual can help too with this. The concept of bargaining with God is one that we may find ourselves caught up in. We can cry out to God for help. If we're at a loss of how to pray, we can use the Psalms to help us. We trust God hears and God responds. We already have a relationship with God, so we can bring all our feelings to God. Our anger, our despair, our fear, our anxiety. We're not alone with any of this. God is our companion in our grief, and God is our source of life and hope. It's often part of grief to be angry, a natural part. It's a natural human experience to be angry at some point when we're grieving. And we know that God is big enough to contain our anger. God does not withdraw from us because we're angry. Rather, God can hold our anger. God listens as we express our anger and bring life in the midst of our angry state. Often when we're angry, we're actually deeply hurt, and what we need is healing of our pain. So it can help us if we know where to take our pain. God heals some of us through the sacraments. For others, being in nature is how God pours balm on our pain. Others might need a skilled listener who can express empathy and kindness. For others, time with family members or prayer on our own is what helps us. Whatever helps us get in touch with the compassion, the comfort, the peace of God is a good place to start when we need healing for our pain. So it can help if we know ourselves well. When have we felt healed before? What has brought us a sense of God's closeness or God's peace in the past? Might we start there? Within the Ignatian tradition, there's a phrase that's often used: look for the life. We trust that God is speaking to us when we notice what is life-giving. We trust the Spirit is at work in us when we're drawn to what brings life. And this is important in the midst of our grief. What brings you life? Where is the life that is God is offering you? The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus can be a framework for us within our grieving. As Jesus needed to let go of life, there are aspects of life that we had before our bereavement that we need to let go of. But it's not a letting go without hope. The death of Jesus was followed by the resurrection. And so we can trust that although we need to let go of aspects of our previous life, we will gradually enter into a resurrected life. We might glimpse this in subtle rather than dramatic ways. Sometimes a loved one dying has profound impacts on our identity. Perhaps we're widowed, or we don't have parents anymore, or we don't have a sibling. It's a huge and often painful adjustment for us to deal with the change to our identity. But we may come back to the bedrock of our identity as children of God. God is still God. We are still God's beloved child. Actions which affirm our identity as a child of God can bring us a sense of peace at a time when we've been shaken up. The community of God's family can surround us with the support and consolation that can ease our lostness. A short poem by Raymond Carver. And did you get what you wanted from this life even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. It's very natural to feel sad after someone we love has died, and it's healthy to accept these feelings. In the midst of this sadness, it can help us to practice gratitude. We practice gratitude towards God for all that God has given us. And one tool that can support us to do this is keeping a gratitude journal. We can use a phone, a computer, a notebook, or just keep it in our heads. It's the practice of noting 3 things we're grateful for each day, and it has a cumulative effect. We might feel initially we can't see anything to be grateful for, but the simplest things can cause us to feel gratitude towards God. And the more we practice this, the more we begin to look for things to be grateful for, the more we notice things that we can be grateful for, the more hopeful we become. As we mentioned in previous talks, there are some bereavements that are particularly painful, such as the loss of a child. And for those who have to endure this, the support of others in a similar situation, such as through the Compassionate Friends organisation, can be very important. And we can remember the loved one we love who died on significant days, on their birthday perhaps, on other days that remind us of them. And the Church's practices of the year's mind, praying for those who've died at the anniversary of their death, can be supportive for us, as can All Souls services, when there's an opportunity to remember within a service those we love who've died. Along with this, there might be regular opportunities in worship to remember our loved ones. Children might participate in these activities. They might find it helpful to make a memory box, a special box containing objects that remind them of the person who died, that they can look at and remember them through. Remembering and taking action can help us to move through grief with hope. We trust that God holds together heaven and earth, us and our loved ones. We trust that God brings life in the midst of death. We trust that God companions us on our journey through grief. We trust that God can hold all our pain, hold us beloved children of God. And so we step forward in our life journey with hope. Thanks be to God.